Okay, we're plodding along in our study of Christian evidences, and we're right where we are. We're on Roman numeral 13. The Bible is from God, and we're just looking at just a couple of brief examples. We spent a lot of time 2 or 3 years ago talking about Bible prophecy several weeks, and it is one of the main lines of evidence for the Bible's inspiration. It's interesting to me that as we mentioned before, there's not too many books that claim inspiration. We thought of the Bible, and you think of the Quran or the Book of Mormon. It's interesting to me that both the Quran and the Book of Mormon were supposedly, they were written by one person. Frankly, one nut, each. But whereas the Bible was written by 40 different men over 1,500 years, and yet their testimony and the things they recorded are all consistent. And we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get down to the unity of the Scripture. But one of the primary lines of evidence for Bible inspiration is biblical prophecy. And before we get back into that, I do want to mention to you an article that just came out in the latest, this is the February issue of Reason and Revelation, and there's several, if you don't get this in the mail, there's several out here on the track racks. But Dave Miller has written, it's a lengthy article, and it's only the first part. The second part will be out next month. But he's written an article on the name Christian in Bible inspiration. It's really outstanding. And he spends a great deal of time discussing Isaiah chapter 62 and Acts 11:26. And you'll want to pick up this and really ingest it. It goes into great detail about the Greek word there in Acts 11 that's found in the New Testament 9 times, and frankly 7 of those times it's translated correctly as a divine commandment or instruction. For some reason in Acts 11:26 and another place, English translators just translated it call, but that's just not, doesn't give the sense of the term. The name that you wear is divinely given. It wasn't just something that people of that day just decided this is what we'll call. This is a name we've been given by God. And so you'll want to pick up this article and read it, and of course get next month's issue too, because it's a two-parter. But I just mention that just because of the timeliness of our discussion with regard to Bible inspiration. And so we were talking about the fact that those who even wrote the Bible, just like Jesus said, look, if you don't believe me, believe the works. And certainly Bible writers said, we didn't follow cunningly devised fables. You could check these things out. And they knew that what they wrote was accurate and was true. And because of that, then we know that that prophecy is one of those important lines of evidence. And the Bible itself talks about in Isaiah and Jeremiah, look, God says, if someone, quote, is supposedly a God, then he ought to be able to tell the future. And our God can tell the future because, if you recall from our study of God and His nature, God can tell us the future because to Him it's not future. He spans, He's not a time-bound being. In fact, in one place it says He sees what? The beginning from the end, because it's all the same to Him. And that's hard to comprehend, but that's why for Him, He knows exactly what's going to happen. And no, that doesn't mean that because He knows that He overrides our free moral agency. But it does mean that because He knows that through His providence He can work out things according to His own will. And so We were looking at a couple of these examples. We looked at the fall of Tyre last week, and we saw that from Ezekiel chapter 26, the prophet prophesied that Nebuchadnezzar would build a siege mount against the city. Many nations would come against it. The city would be broken down, scraped like the top of a rock, and all the stones and timber and the soil would be thrown in the midst of the water, and then it would become a place for spreading of nets and would never be rebuilt. And we saw that from secular history, how that even though Nebuchadnezzar took the mainland city, and there were several other assaults on the city over the years, it was Alexander the Great, of course, that took what was left of the mainland city and threw it into the ocean to build himself a land bridge to the island sea, and thereby take what was left of the city of Tyre, the Phoenician kingdom. And so, again, because of these things are so accurate, it got me to thinking as I was reading Brother Miller's article, maybe. But it got me to thinking about the way that the skeptics try to late date everything when it comes to biblical prophecy. Isaiah and other books, Daniel, they'll claim were written maybe in the 1st century, BC or something, by some Jew that lived later. The problem with that, of course, is we have since found, since many of our versions were written, the Dead Sea Scrolls, which go back further. And then what do you do with the Septuagint? Which is a Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures in what year? You're still looking between 200 and 300 BC. And so, it seems to me that this idea of trying to late date everything kind of falls on its face based on what we already have. So we were looking at the fall of Babylon, I believe, and the rise of Cyrus when we left off last week. And we noticed that if you go into Isaiah, Babylon is described in chapter 13 as the glory of kingdoms. But he says in chapter 13 it's going to be taken and destroyed by the Medes and the Persians. He also declares or mentions in chapters 44 and 45, and let's go there, Isaiah 44, a man by the name of Cyrus. And we were looking at that last week, and he actually calls Cyrus his anointed. And Cyrus is mentioned by name here as the conqueror of Babylon some 150 years before he's born. That's pretty accurate stuff. You can call somebody by name. And about 200 years before he actually took the city in 539 BC. Calls him his shepherd and his anointed. So let's go back over to Jeremiah chapter 50. We looked at this quite a bit actually when we were talking about biblical prophecy 2 or 3 years ago in our class. But I always enjoy looking at these two chapters because some of the predictions that are made about the fall of the city. Notice verse, chapter 50, like my Bible begins the chapter, Judgment on Babylon, the word that the Lord spoke against Babylon, so forth. But look at verse 38. A drought is against her waters, and they will be dried up. For it is the land of carved images, and they are insane with their idols. Look at chapter 51, verse 36. Therefore thus says the Lord, Behold, I will plead your case and take vengeance for you. I will dry up her sea and make her springs dry. Well, I think many of you know the story or the account of how Cyrus took the city. But you go back to Daniel and you know that on the night that the city was taken, what were the Babylonians doing? They were partying. And it's hard to defend yourself when you're drunk. Look at chapter 51, verse 57. Look at the accuracy of these things. And I will make drunk her princes and wise men, her governors, her deputies, and her mighty men. And notice, first they're going to be drunk, and then what's going to happen? They're going to sleep a perpetual sleep, and not awake, says the king, whose name is the Lord of love. So here's Belshazzar throwing this drunken party, drinking out of the vessels from the temple. This hand writes on the wall, comes out of nowhere. And a hand writes on the wall, and he is so scared that his knees knock together. And Daniel says, this is it for you. You've been weighed in the balances and found wanting. And that very night, Cyrus rechannels the river Euphrates. It runs under the city walls of Babylon into some basin, and his army actually goes under the city walls into the city and takes it. So here God says, look, I'm going to send Cyrus, and he says all this 150 years, 200 years before it happens. I'm going to send Cyrus, the Medes and Persians. They're going to dry up the water. Your soldiers and princes are going to be drunk, and because of that, you're going to sleep a perpetual sleep. You're going to be slaughtered, defeated in battle. So that is prophecy. That is fulfilled, accurate prophecy. And so many times in the Bible, they ask the question, well, who can do that? God says, who can do that? If you're God, you should be able to do that. And our God can do that, and He has done that. Now, obviously, the most impressive of prophecies we can talk about, and we are going to, and I've just listed it here, but we're not going to talk about it today, because I've reserved it for the last section of our study on Christ Himself. But the most impressive array of prophecies are those some 250 to 300 prophecies of who? Yeah, the Messiah. And extremely accurate. And of course, the interesting thing about those prophecies is sometimes the critics would say, well, and we'll just mention this before we move on. The critics would say, well, here's what Jesus did. You know, he picked up the Old Testament, Septuagint. He quoted that a lot, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. He picked it up, and he learned all the Messianic prophecies that he could, and what did he do? Yeah, he went around his whole life trying to fulfill them. Well, that's fine, I guess, for some things. But I think about Micah 5:2, it's hard to fulfill what? Where you're born, what town you're born in. Or, it's kind of hard to determine where you're going to be buried. I mean, we can somewhat. You can go out and buy you a burial plot today. But I guess there's no guarantee after you're gone somebody's going to stick you in it. But you can prepare somewhat. But Jesus lived, a poor life after he quit the carpenter business. Well, he wasn't that wealthy to begin with, even when he was a carpenter. But after the carpenter business, he was supported by who? Women. The women that followed him, some rich women supported his ministry. So he didn't have a burial plot or a funeral plan. And yet the Bible says he would be buried with the what? Rich. Which he was. And that's kind of hard to control too. So we'll look at some of those when we get to that part of our study. But as we move on from prophecy and just looking at a couple of these things to make our point about it being one of the primary lines of evidence for the Bible being the Word of God. Now let's go back and look one more time at these passages. Look at Isaiah 46 and 41. Let's go back there. You love, it's certainly the case that and men of God have always had senses of humor. There's one place, and I'm not going to really look at it, there's one place where Isaiah makes fun of. And obviously it's the Holy Spirit making fun of people who would worship idols. Because he says, you know, what do? You take a stump, you take a piece of wood, and what do you do? Well, you cut it in several pieces, and you take one piece and you make a fire with it, cook, and you may use it for several other things. And then you take another piece of it, and you carve it into a little idol, and then you bow down to it as if this is going to, you know, do something for you. But look at Isaiah 41 and look at, 46, but you weren't listening because I said 41 and 46. Actually, I said it backwards. I said 46 and then I said 41. Let's go to 41 first. Look at 41:21. I'm just joking. Present your case, says the Lord. Bring forth your strong reason, says the King of Jacob. Let them bring forth and show us what will happen. Let them show the former things what they were, that we may consider them and know the latter end of them, or declare to us things to come. Show the things that are to come hereafter, that we may know that you are gods. Yes, do good or do evil, that we may be dismayed and see it together. Indeed, you are nothing, and your work is nothing. He who chooses you is an abomination. God said in the long ago through Isaiah, well, what about your idols? Let them tell us what's going to happen. If they're gods, go to chapter 46. Look at verse 9 or 8. Remember this and show yourselves men. Recall to mind, O ye transgressors. Remember the former things of old. For I am God, and there is no other. I am God, and there is none like me. Declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times things that are not yet done. Saying, my counsel shall stand, and I will do all my pleasure. Well, again, God says that's the difference between me and false gods. As I can tell you what's going to happen. And I have, and He has a lot. Throughout the Old Testament and fulfilled in the New, or even later in the Old Testament sometimes. All right, let's move on to our next point. That was predictive prophecy, which was A. So our next line of evidence for the Bible as given from God is its scientific accuracy and foreknowledge. And we're going to spend quite a bit of time on this, although, again, we could spend a lot more than we're going to. But you can see I got a pretty hefty list up there. The Bible is not a scientific, it's not a science book. It's not a medical textbook. But, that being said, if it's from God, then if there are things that touch on scientific matters, as we would call them, that is, and by the way, what is science? Somebody define science for me. It's generally just the study of the natural world. Study of the natural world. It is not the study of the metaphysical. It's not the study of the spiritual world. You can't put the spiritual world in a test tube. I can't put the Hadean realm. I can't put God. I can't put angel. I can't put anything that I can't see. And there's a lot, by the way. In fact, there may be more that I can't see than I can see. If I go to the book of Daniel, I find out that there's all kinds of things going on behind the scenes that I have no idea. Right? The prince of the kingdom of Persia was fighting, with Daniel was talking about, Gabriel was sent to fight with this guy. There are all kinds of things going on behind the scenes that I don't know. God's not saw fit to tell us. We don't need to know. But the point is that anything in the spiritual realm, which is the most important realm, I can't see and I can't put in a test tube, so it's not subject to scientific study. And so scientists who claim that science proves there is no God, that's foolishness, because that's not subject to the scientific method. Science only deals with the natural realm and the study of the natural world. And we know, and frankly, that as time goes by and more scientific discoveries are made, we find out that maybe something we thought was true in the past is no longer correct. Now, there are some things that are just not going to change. There are certain laws of science that we found no exceptions to. But it's interesting to me. Go look at your average high school or college textbook and see how many editions that are in. Just look, see how many times it's been reprinted and updated.
One of those planets is not a planet anymore.
That's right. Yeah, and that's really disappointing. You know, I grew up with, what, 9 planets? Now I'm told one of them's not a planet.
But then they find new ones all the time too.
But the good thing is now you can name your own star. If you're just willing to pay the $50. By the way, God's already named them all, so it's kind of a waste of time. It changes, though. And we find out, look, there was at one point in the world that people thought asbestos was a good idea. Well, it works. There's no question about that. It's a flame retardant. Or what about, lead paint? That's a good idea. We don't use that anymore either. So things change. What we would expect from the Bible, though, is a couple things. Now, this book is approximately how old? How old is this book? The oldest part of it. New Testament itself is 2,000 years old. How old is the Old Testament? About 3,500 years old. Moses lived approximately 1,500 BC. Well, this is a book that's 3,500 years old. There's been a lot of discoveries in 3,500 years. People don't believe what they used to believe about certain things in the natural world. So, what we would expect, number one, is when we read, if this Bible's inspired, if it's from God, number one, we would expect when it speaks on matters that are scientific or medical, we would expect accuracy. And what I mean by that is, if I go back 3,500 years, and we're going to talk about this, there's going to be all kinds of weird, cultures had all kinds of weird ideas about, the way the world worked or what was good medical practice. And they made all kinds of strange errors. I should find none of that in the Bible. The Bible should be scientifically and medically accurate, not making the same mistakes as the cultures were making that it was written in, number one. And number two, I should be able to find places where it actually is ahead of its time in some of the statements he makes, which is what we refer to as scientific foreknowledge, right? So I would expect both accuracy when it does speak on these things. Again, it's not a textbook or science book, but when it speaks in these matters, I should expect both accuracy. The God of the universe wrote it, and I should expect some scientific foreknowledge. Some information that those people back then didn't have, that maybe we just now have. On the other hand, the skeptic's going to have to show what about this 3,500-year-old book? What's he need to show? I need to show no errors. As a Christian, I should be able to do that. He needs to show some errors. Yeah. He needs to show some mistakes in those areas.
You try all the time.
And they try. You're right. They do their best. So, number one. And we've talked about these first couple before, so we won't spend much time on them. Because we talked about these when it comes to evidence for the existence of God himself. But look at the Bible's position on the law of biogenesis. Bio means life, Genesis means beginning. And what this law says is that in the material world, life comes only from life, and that of its previous kind. Okay? And it's called a law. Why? We know of no known exceptions. And believe me, in times past, people believed in spontaneous generation. That is, life could just pop into existence from non-life. But after thousands of experiments, and if you were like me in grade school, you know, you heard of the name Louis Pasteur, who supposedly drove the dagger, the final dagger, into this idea of spontaneous generation. You know that life can't come from non-living matter. And they've tried, and they're still trying in laboratories all over the world. And it's not happening. And the interesting thing, of course, that is that in order to have, for the theory of evolution to work, you have to have spontaneous generation. At some point, life had to come from non-life. And yet that is a violation of the law of biogenesis. Turn to Genesis chapter 1. The Bible, does it make that mistake? No. "3,500 years ago, Moses wrote, God said, let the earth bring forth the living creature according to its kind. Cattle and creeping thing, the beasts of the earth, each according to its kind. And it was so, and so forth. If you go back up and you look at the sea creatures, and you look at the seed and the plants and all the things that God created that are living, it says they're going to produce after what? Their kind. And so the law of biogenesis, the Bible doesn't make that mistake. And yet, up until just a few, maybe even 200, 300 years ago, people thought that spontaneous generation was still possible. The Bible never thought that. God never said that. Well, quickly, let's look at the laws of thermodynamics. We've talked about these a lot, so we won't spend much time here. You know, there are actually, and I didn't mention this, there are actually 4 primary laws of thermodynamics. But we generally only talk about 2 when it comes to this controversy. One is the conservation of energy, and the other one is the one known as, the second law is the one that is known as the law of entropy. But the law of conservation of energy, the first law of thermodynamics says what? In a closed system that what? Matter can neither be what? Created or destroyed. Right? So that's law number 1. Number 2, the second law, known as entropy, says that everything's moving toward a state of disorder. Things are wearing out. In other words, energy gets used, and once it gets used, it's in a less usable state. For instance, and that's not hard to understand, if I burn a piece of paper, if I take a piece of paper here and set it on fire, I'm not really destroying any matter, you understand, but it is being changed. Right? The energy and the gases that are released are just less usable than they were before. I can't use them as a piece of paper. But they didn't go out of existence. But the second law is just common sense. Rooms get messier over time. Automobiles wear out. And as Brother Tom pointed out to me before class started, your body wears out too. You just can't play ping pong like you used to. Much less real tennis, right?
What did you say the first sentence?
Yeah, matter's neither created nor destroyed. Well, let's look at that. Go to Genesis chapter 2. First law of thermodynamics. You just mentioned. Matter can neither be created nor destroyed. Well, it's right here in Genesis chapter 2. Verse 1. Thus the heavens and the earth and all the host of them were what? Finished. Is there any creating going on today? Anything new being created? No. And on the 7th day God ended his work which he had done, and he rested. Now that's he rested on the 7th day. Well, God doesn't rest. But that just means he ceased, and he didn't do anything that day. And he did that really for our purposes and for the Israelite purposes. Well, really for everybody. We have 7 days in a week. But he rested on the 7th from all his work which he had done. Well, God was tired, is what I'm trying to say. But the bottom line is it says, verse 3, he blessed the seventh day, sanctified it, because in it he rested from all his work which he had created and made. So he did it, and he finished it, right? So it's neither being created nor destroyed. Well, go to Hebrews chapter 1. We got the second law, and actually Hebrews chapter 1 is a quote from the Old Testament. Actually, just about the whole chapter of Hebrews chapter 1 is a quote from the Old Testament. But this particular verse, it goes, look down about verse 10. Second law. Psalm 102, maybe. Yeah. Verse 10 and 11. 10 through 12. You, Lord, in the beginning laid the foundation of the earth, and the heavens are the work of your hands. They will perish, but you remain, and they will grow old like a garment. Well, clothes wear out. Like a cloak, you will fold them up, and they will be changed, but you are the same, and your years will not fade. Now God, it's interesting, the Hebrew writer says, in quoting you from the Psalms, that God's not subject to the law, second law of thermodynamics. He doesn't get old, he doesn't wear out, he doesn't get tired, but material things do. All material things, everything in this physical universe is subject to the second law of thermodynamics. So, first and second laws of thermodynamics, the Bible gets that right. And it knew that 3,500 years ago. What about the number of stars? This is kind of funny. I just kind of threw this in because up until the early 1900s, people still thought that you could count. I'm talking about stand on the ground and count the stars. There was a Greek astronomer, Hipparchus, 2 centuries before Christ, who said, well, there's anywhere from 800 to 1,080 stars. Another guy said, well, I think there's about 2,500, but that doesn't include the ones the sailors can see when they're out in the sea. Now, after you've got these gazillion-dollar telescopes, and you can actually put those in space, so there's no distortion from Earth's atmosphere, or you can see them from the moon. Does anybody know how many stars they estimate in the universe and all the galaxies, the different galaxies that are out there? Anybody know? Let's take a wild guess. Yeah, billions, thousands of billions, if you can put your mind around that. Go to Genesis chapter 15. Now, did God say, oh, by the way, Abraham, there's about 1,000 stars. And, your descendants are going to be like that, right? Verse 5, then he brought him outside, God and Abram, and said, look now toward heaven and count the stars if you are able to number them. And he said to him, so shall your descendants be. What's he saying to Abram on this occasion? What's he really saying to him? How many descendants are you going to have, Abram? You can't count them. They're not. You can't estimate the number of descendants. And he's, by the way, he's not just talking about physical descendants. He's not just talking about physical descendants. He's talking about spiritual descendants. We're the children of Abraham, Paul says. So you can't count how many you're going to have. Innumerable. And so, again, the Bible, even in Abram's day, God told Abram, you can't count the stars. Well, we didn't know that until a couple hundred years ago. That we couldn't count. Well, all right. Here's where it gets fun. Medical medical acumen of the Bible. This is always the fun part because you have to deal with the Egyptians. Now Moses was educated in the culture of the Egyptians. Prince of Egypt. Right? So, Stephen said in Acts chapter 7 that he was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. So with such training, you would think that when you read the Pentateuch, that would include a lot of what? Yeah, Egyptian wisdom, medical and otherwise, right? If Moses just wrote it on his own. And there are some medical practices in the Pentateuch that are similar to those found in Egyptian documents, but there is a conspicuous absence of all the harmful malpractice that you would have found in the Egyptian medical field. And in fact, if you've read any books at all about the Pentateuch, read the book, None of These Diseases. I would encourage you to do that. But everything that Moses stated pertaining to health and the medical well-being of the Israelites, frankly, could be implemented today. It wouldn't be inconsistent with the things that we do. When it comes to germ spreading, epidemic disease control. I mean, look at the news. What's the first thing we do now when there's a virus outbreak in China? Quarantine. No ancient civilizations knew anything about quarantine except who? The Israelites. So we'll look at some of these things. But the Egyptians, they were it. They were the top of the field, medically speaking, in the ancient world. It was the medical center of the ancient world. During the days even of the Medes and Persians, the historian Herodotus recorded that it was King Darius' practice to keep in attendance certain Egyptian doctors who had a reputation for being top of their field. And they've got a lot of ancient documents that detail a lot of this Egyptian medical knowledge. Number one being the Ebers Papyrus, discovered in 1872 by a German Egyptologist named, guess what, George Ebers. And it has a host of medical remedies, supposedly to heal, enhance, and prevent. 811 prescriptions in this papyrus. You got salves, plasters, poultices, snuffs, inhalations, gargles, draughts, confections, pills, fumigations, suppositories, and enemas. Doesn't that sound fun? And you got some disgusting treatments in this papyrus. What should you do to draw out a splinter in your finger? Anybody? Get you some tweezers. Well, they had a remedy in this thing consisting of worm blood, mole, and donkey dung. Doctors S.I. McMillan and David Stern note that dung is loaded with tetanus spores, and a simple splinter often resulted in a gruesome death from lockjaw. If you were an Egyptian. Remedies to help heal skin diseases included such prescriptions as a hog's tooth, cat's dung, dog's dung, some kind of oil and berries. And you put all that on there as a poultice. Here's some other ingredients from different remedies. Dried excrement of a child, hog dung, farmer's urine. I don't know what it has to be a farmer. Here's a recipe to prevent hair growth that includes a lizard dung and the blood from a cow, donkey, pig, dog, and stag. Now, good. That's not to say they didn't have some good remedies. Man, a lot of this stuff was just superstitious. They used opium a lot, excrement. They had this, I don't know what the deal with excrement and dung. They seem to have, I think that was the cure for everything. I love this one. Talking about urine. It is said that the urine of a faithful wife was with them effective in the treatment of sore eyes. So, I guess if you had sore eyes and you treated your eyes and they didn't get better, then you knew you had a problem with your wife, I'm assuming. I don't know. Now you're laughing, but this was the kind of thing in vogue when Moses wrote the Pentateuch. They were also among the first to present the idea of good and laudable pus. Infection was good, pus was a good thing, and so they killed a lot of people just by deliberately infecting the wounds so they could get some pus. Yeah, I mean, so, next week, we will pick up with prescriptions in the Pentateuch. And we'll look at some of the things that Moses had to say about medical remedies and actually what God had to say.
Hebrews